So welcome everyone. We have a nice group here together today, and as Ahmed mentioned, we'll try to keep this light and interactive. So if you have any questions, please do feel free to to ask. I'm sure others would have the same. So with that, I'll go ahead and I'll share my screen, and we'll dive right in. All right. Hopefully this works. Let's see. Okay, we're great. Okay. Well, so we're going to keep it a little bit philosophical, a little bit technical today when we go through R&D strategy for medical devices. And I want to start, just with a little bit of background on Baylis and who we are. So we're known now as a company that designs and develops medical devices, but our actual start as a medical device was by Miss Gloria Baylis as a distributor of medical devices. And through that distribution of those products came the idea and opportunity to design, develop, and manufacture our own therapies and our own products to solve very particular pathologies in certain spaces. We have a focus on radio frequency energy typically, and we use that to do different things in and around the body. We've commercialized many products around the world. Last year, we had divested our cardiology product line to Boston Scientific. I think one of the largest exits in Canadian medical device history. But we continue on, and we have a great number of people here that are still working on radiology, spine products, interventional oncology, and others. I already did this, so I'll skip that part. So just talking today a little bit about, what exactly we're going to cover. We're going to really try to get the idea across of how do you approach developing a medical device. And a lot of it is more philosophical than you might appreciate. And so we'll walk you through that, and hopefully there's an example in there that hopefully will make it more real and easier to understand and digest. So once we kind of go over how to approach the problem definition and how to approach a design problem, we'll talk about the standard structure that medical device companies around the world use to realize those innovations, and how to then put that in a particular sequence so that you're tackling the project in the right way, such that by the time you get to the end, you have a hopefully realizable, commercially viable product that can be used to improve patient welfare. Additionally, as a small addendum to this, though I'm not an expert by any stretch on AI-enabled technologies, we thought it might be interesting, Ahmed and I discussed that maybe just a few slides on, if you are working in that space, how you might consider developing products using AI or machine learning, and what technical or regulatory challenges may come in front of you in that space. All right, so at a very high level, this is how we're going to approach the problem for developing medical devices. So first, we're going to talk a little bit about how to clearly define the goal. And this is by far the most complex and difficult part because almost all of us, especially technical folks, feel like we already understood this. Otherwise, how could we have developed a concept or prototyped or even know what we're working on? But quite frequently, that goal is poorly defined, and that has a very important complication or implication for how you realize a product. But once you get that, there are very specific strategies and actions that fall out from there that help us realize products in the space. So what is the goal? So the goal of R&D is stated here. This is a definition I made, so you might find others. But the way we've looked at it over the last couple of decades here is we have to be really careful that we identify the defined need or problem statement. And that we'll talk more about it, but this is the stumbling block that most innovators have, which is they try to expand the need to either fit the technology that they've developed, or they try to cover too many needs with their innovation, and then therefore are trying to solve too big a problem. So the goal of R&D is to develop a solution that meets a very particular defined need, and then all while doing so under a variety of constraints. So the constraints include time, which I'll explain each one of these in an upcoming slide, cost, the regulatory environment, IP considerations, and importantly, what is considered an acceptable level of risk. So those are like specific items that we'll talk about in detail, as I mentioned. And the final factor inside defining the goal is that we have to have the mindset that we want to bring this to market. Now, that sounds obvious, but a lot of times as innovators, we get hung up that this product isn't fully fleshed out. It doesn't have all the widgets and gizmos that maybe a competitor product has. So we're not ready to bring it to market. But a mindset that we need to bring our unique innovation to market and drive early adoption and then perhaps iterate once we're out there is an important consideration. So this is what we're trying to do in R&D. Solve a defined need within constraints with the mindset that we're trying to get it out. We're not trying to necessarily get it perfect, but we do need to get it out and start helping patients. Before I go on to the next slide, the way I've often described this to engineers at Baylis who are starting is to consider the patient who is waiting for your technology, and consider that if it was a family member. Is that family member better served by having a version of your product out sooner and therefore getting a better quality treatment today? Or would it make sense to wait a year or two or longer to get a slightly improved version, and then they have to delay that treatment? And if you take that mentality of what's best for the patient and how quickly can I bring this improvement to patient welfare to the market, that will align your thinking with a go-to-market type mentality. All right, so we talked about the defined need, and what is that? In plain terms, when you have a need that's very, very clear, meaning you understand it fully, you'll know that you've got it right because it opens up a lot of doors for you in the development program. So first of all, it has to provide a very, very compelling value statement, meaning you could explain it to someone like the classic elevator pitch or to a doctor in, let's say, 10 seconds. And they say, I have patients who need that. Where is it already? Like, why haven't you already made it? And so if you don't have that type of statement prepared, or you don't have that clarity with what you're working on, you probably don't have a very well-defined need identified either. The other thing is that if you have the defined need sorted out, and we can bring examples in a moment, if you don't have that need, you really can't very clearly imagine how this is all going to come through on the end. And so if you have one, you'll be able to see, and this is again a bit philosophical, but it's very typical at least when we've done this part of the exercise, that we can already imagine how this product is going to be developed, what the testing is going to look like, what type of regulatory framework is going to be needed, how the doctors are going to accept it, what kind of studies we're going to need, what the risks are, because we've really understood, what exactly the type of patient, the type of pathology we're trying to treat, and it kind of gels in your mind. Finally, it's, or I should say not finally, but the third one is that it's informed and therefore practical. So the simple way of saying this is that if you really understand what you're trying to solve, that means you must also know everything about it, the anatomy, the pathophysiology, the current treatment paradigms, what the competition is doing, what the limitations of the competition are, what is left on the table, meaning what needs to be improved upon. And so you would have to know all that in order to really be able to define that there is an incremental need. And if you haven't done that work, it's unlikely that you have, as I mentioned at the beginning, a very clear understanding of it. And finally, and this is probably the most important part, is it is very humble. So if there's a clinical need to improve patient welfare in whatever field of medicine you're working in, and you've already got it in your mind's eye that your product is the one to do that, then what you're going to do is you're going to corrupt the 3 previous bullet points by saying that this is what it needs to do, here's the value statement, and it all leads towards the product you've already imagined. And what that'll do is it will immediately put you in a position where you got blinders on and you haven't thought about the problem fully. And you might get blindsided by a superior technology that will just make yours obsolete. And I say that from firsthand experience. We've had that happen in just recent years, where we were developing something for years, and then in 1 second, the field announced a different way of doing the underlying procedure, which made the whole thing we were working on obsolete, literally overnight. And so, we didn't consider well enough that the need of the patient was different than how we had envisioned it. And so these are really all important considerations when you're looking at it, is not to be so in love with what you're working on that you don't understand exactly what is the value that you're trying to bring to physicians or patients. Again, and this is very high level. We'll bring it down to more practical examples as we go along. So I won't belabor to this too much, but when you have that sentence, and we actually go through the effort of making 1 or 2 sentences, it takes weeks for us to get there at the beginning of a project. But when we have a very carefully constructed sentence that defines exactly what the clinical need is, we'll staple that to our forehead, so to speak, and we'll look up at that from time to time, especially when you get up to your eyeballs in the middle of medical device development. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of choices, from picking a design option, or selecting a vendor, or having a manufacturing issue, or adding more things, or patenting more things, or seeing what the competition's doing. There's a lot of opportunity to get distracted, and we keep that very carefully crafted value proposition, or what exactly we're adding to the patient, right in front of us, so that we know what we're doing and why we're doing it. And it acts like a lighthouse. It helps make sure that we're staying on target with that mentality of bringing things to market. So if we know that, okay, we need to bring this, patients are waiting, there's other things we want to do, we'll put it on the bullpen, we'll come back to them, but this is the need that needs to be answered. Has anything changed? No. Okay, then we have to stay focused and drive the project in a particular way. Okay, let's go through some of the constraints in terms of, when you bring a product to market, what do you have to worry about? So the obvious one is time. Like, you need to get the product done in a certain time, but it might not be obvious as to why. The reality is that your idea, whatever innovation you have, has an inherent shelf life. And I'm not just talking about patents or whatnot, but the nature of medical treatments and innovation is happening, above and beyond what you're working on. And there'll be a natural time, a window, where your product has the maximum opportunity to improve patient welfare. And so you need to get it out, right? And the reality is, you need to get it out and learn from real life cases, and from physicians, and ultimately even from patients, how exactly your product performs, and what the next generation could be, and all that. And there's only so much time you have to do that. And there's an interesting paradox we found, is that if you spend too much time in development trying to perfect this, because you have a shelf life of when your product is actually going to be useful, you actually have less time in the market. So your actual market opportunity is less if you spend too much time overcooking it. And also, the more you add to the product, the harder it is to get out. And we'll talk more about that. Like, the greater the complexity for B&B, the more questions the regulators ask, the more IP risks you actually undertake. So the more you do, very often, the less you get at the tail end. Of course, on the opposite side, if you don't spend enough time making a product that's going to meet the needs, then there's no one's going to buy it at all. That goes without saying. So therefore, again, how do you approach this constraint of time? It's really, really useful to understand, for the type of product or project you're working on, what is a standard development framework that other startups like yours, or small to medium-sized companies, would plan for, and then use that as a guide. It doesn't have to be a hard boundary on which you can't make it shorter or longer, but you should get an understanding of what that is. And why is because that likely has been field tested to say this level of complexity, or this type of product, this type of value, is a 1 year, 2 year, 3 year type project. Then okay, well, that's, if it's going to be done in a year, I got to be thinking about the product in a much different way than if it's a 5-year program. There's different risks, different investments, different number of resources that you would bring to bear. It might even give you insights as to the size of the market in ways you weren't expecting. If it's that easy to make, if it takes 6 months, maybe the market's not as big as you expected. Or if it takes much longer, maybe you bit off more than you can chew. And the flip could be true too, could be very positive. Once you've done that, what we do internally at Baylis anyways, is we do an exercise where we calculate everything. We do a bottom-up analysis of what the project ought to take, factoring in all the different divisions or departments that would be stakeholders to that product development process. And then we try cutting the project in half. Why? It's not to make our people miserable. It's to field test some of our assumptions. So we do an honest evaluation to say, okay, if I had to cut it in half, what would have to go, right? And what you end up doing sometimes is cutting some parts of the design or some parts, some of your assumptions. And after looking at it, you might say, well, actually, I don't need that when I go back and look at my defined need. And it'll help you focus your project. And that'll be a theme you'll hear me talk about a lot today, is reducing the scope and risk of your work, because medical devices are very complex and very burdensome to get out, and they only get more risky the further out they are from the time you start designing it. Once they're in the field, all the variables of how physicians use it or the patient's presentation, disease presentation, you don't control that. So therefore, having less complexity up front gives you the best chance of fully validating, verifying, and assuring stability of your product or your design, so that it has the best chance of accommodating all the unknowns in the open market. All right, so moving along. And again, feel free to, I'm just going to keep talking until someone stops me. So feel free to jump in if anyone has questions. Okay, so costs. I mean, anyone who's in a startup obviously is evaluating costs. That goes without saying. But just like time, I think it's very useful to have an understanding of what is the scope typically for a product development like this. And if you don't know, go ask someone. Most people who have, especially in Canada, I find, who have been down these roads before, are very eager to share their knowledge and experience with other entrepreneurs, startups, or people who are getting along in medical devices. And so don't be shy. Just ask, like, hey, I'm working on a project. This is what it is. How long do you think it would take, and what kind of budget should I keep? And that'll give you, probably a good order of magnitude framework from which you can take your decision making. What I've found very interesting is that when we ask the R&D folks, we usually find that they underestimate the amount of work. So they'll say, hey, this is how much it is. And you should, if you're responsible for R&D, you should presume that your budget's half. So let's say you say, hey, I think it's a $2 million project. Then when you're in R&D, if you're one responsible for doing that, presume you only have $1 million. Right? And the reason why is it always gets more complicated. It literally never gets easier than you expected down the road. So if you give yourself that buffer, that's very useful. Conversely, if you're in finance and and the R&D folks tell you, hey, look, it's only going to cost $1 million to do it, you better go find 2 million because of the same reasons. So just some tips from the field there. That framework, though, is very useful for decision making, of course, and it'll help. Again, it'll help you focus in terms of what you need to invest in and what don't you need to invest in. And I think what I've found very interesting in my experience is that when you put a box of these constraints on the technical people, and again, this is the opposite of how when I first started Bayless, how I used to think about it. I used to think, give the people the space. I'm an engineer by training, so I would say, give me my room and I'll figure it all out for you. But what I found actually is if you give people the constraints, hey, it needs to get done in 6 months for this much money, and we'll talk about the other risks, actually it enables more creativity because they have the boundaries in which they need to design. Whereas if there's no boundaries, the solution space is too large and you don't actually get enough concentration of thinking to actually find creative solutions. So if you're responsible for R&D strategies, don't be afraid to take a hard management decision and say, look, we got this much time, we got this much money, and this is the regulatory and other risks that we have to account for, and this is how we're going to do it. Find me a solution in here. And if you do that, you'll actually motivate your team to, come up with something interesting.
Hi, Neil. This is Sangeeta. I have a quick question regarding this slide. So as you said that look for the R&D for the financing, ask their suggestion and finances. And based on the present scenario, I find that supply chain is also becoming the issue because of material handling or resourcing the materials. So do you think that the supply chain has to be also involved in the beginning, that how long it will take to procure the materials?
Yeah, 100%. So when I say R&D, I should preface this. So at Bayless, we're an R&D centric organization historically. So R&D was responsible and is responsible for looking at a project and determining what the entire life cycle is going to look like. Like how, when we start today, how are we going to get it out to the field? And of course, we pass parts of the project to our folks in operations or process engineering or supply chain, regulatory, IP, marketing. All those different departments are involved, but R&D is responsible for coordinating those different stakeholders and putting that into a comprehensive plan at the beginning. Like, what is it going to take? And for sure, supply chain is, you need to be thinking on a couple fronts, which I'll share later on, but it's supply chain. And for a new product development, the manufacturing process, or the way that something gets made. If you're making something very bespoke, you might be in for a very long lead time for tooling or customized components, or even standardized components nowadays, like you're saying, Sangeeta, of lead times that we're seeing anywhere from 6, 9 to 12 months. So all those things are that they factor back into that other constraint of time. Like if you're going to get a lot of bespoke components and everything's got a 12-month lead time, and you have to serialize it for some reason, well, you're never going to get it done. And you're going to have to go back to the team and say, like, you need to figure out a different way to solve this problem because we have this constraint in the field that needs to be accounted for, and we just can't eat that 8-9 month delay in the project. So you're right, and when I say R&D, it means really you could think of it like a project management function, really, in the way I'm presenting it here, and all departments should be considered. All right, I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Yes.
All right. Okay, so the other one is IP, and this is one that especially I know when I started at Baylis and in the engineering department, we're all excited to develop intellectual property and come up with patents and whatnot. And my understanding of what IP meant and what it doesn't mean has been highly skewed by the reality of what it is. And don't get me wrong, intellectual property is one of the primary value drivers of anything we do. And we have a very extensive IP portfolio and team dedicated to developing patents around the world for the technologies we make. And there's different ways you have to look at IP. So the first thing is you need to get on with the hard work of reading patents that already exist in your space, get comfortable with Google's patent search, get comfortable with reading a patent and the way it's structured. Find a YouTube video on how all patents are structured, especially ones from the US PTO. They follow a particular format. The language is structured in a certain way. And once you've read a few, then you can read a lot, and you'll know how to really focus your efforts as you go through and look at competitive IP. And you need to understand it. There's just no way around it. That's the homework. And the reality is that if you're working on something, unless you come up with the underlying science in a completely new way, the odds that you're completely alone in this space that you think you are working on that no one's ever done is very low. And the key thing is, do not get frazzled by the fact that you might find a patent that is close to you. The reality is, when you get into IP, the incremental gains are really what are being patented to a great extent with the patents that are being put out there. And so there's usually space. Now, that doesn't mean if you find something that's literally the exact copy of your product, go ahead. I'm not saying that. But at the same time, you need to understand exactly what that patent is saying, what the claims are saying, what stage of prosecution is it in, and all those kind of things. So get educated here. You don't have to read 500 patents, but you should have a decent understanding of what's going on in the space. And so that when you look at the defined need and how you're intending to add value, can you see the difference? You should at least be able to articulate to another technical person, our product is different than those patents in these particular ways. A good patent lawyer will be able to articulate that in a patent, such that you have your own IP. And also, it's not a guarantee. It's a little bit different for freedom to operate, but they're close cousins. And if you have a unique value proposition, you probably can develop the freedom to operate analysis that you'll need to. So anyways, it's a very dense topic, but worth getting a cursory understanding. Anyone who's in development needs to know how to read a patent. On our side here at Baylis, all our senior folks have at least part of their job description is reading IP, both the ones we develop and the ones from our competition. All right, so continuing on. Okay, this is a really important slide, and I certainly one I never understood when I first started at Bayless, which is what is an acceptable level of risk, and this is the most misunderstood and poorly applied constraint. And we typically what happens is that, and this happens at Bayless too, is there's two different ways people kind of react when they develop a product and they're going through all the V&V and they're thinking through how the product's going to be used clinically, or they're doing clinical studies or animal studies and something comes up, is they see all risk as bad and all risk as their own problem, and that it has to be overcome by technology or something. And the reality is that that's not how any medical device out there in the world that's in the market actually was brought to market. There is something called acceptable levels of risk. And there's clearly a red line on what's an unacceptable risk. And it's not just based on the regulatory things. There are business considerations and other things too. But you really need to understand when you're working on a product, what is an unacceptable or acceptable level of risk. And I'll give you an example, maybe not a good one, and this is being recorded, so I'll be careful. But you might have a product, a hypothetical product, that first gets handled by a scrub nurse before it's passed to a surgeon who's going to use it in a patient. Okay. And let's say during development, you have a packaging system that is sterile packaging, and the scrub nurse has got to, get presented the sterile product, and then they need to handle it and then put it on the sterile tray so the surgeon can use it. And you developed it, it looks good, everything makes sense. You start doing your initial evaluations, and you noticed in a couple of cases the scrub nurse can't take the product out perfectly, and they have to throw out a couple of products because they touched, the sterile barrier or something like that. Now, that's not a good situation, but what's the level of risk there? And is it acceptable in the face of, all the rest of the products that are going well? Is it happening 1 out of 1,000 times? Is it happening 1 out of 2 times? And you need to get comfortable with taking some of those decisions and how to think through that, because otherwise you're going to get stagnated in your design, because everything's going to hit you like a problem that you have to solve. And I'm not saying to abdicate your responsibility at all, but you need to be very clear-minded as to what is a problem to solve and what is a problem not to solve, and how much of this problem is already in the market with the surgeons or the doctors you're using it with. If they're already accommodating a certain risk as part of their surgical practice, then you have to think that through. Is that really a problem that you ought to be solving? And once you understand that, it changes your perspective on what does your product really need to do. So that's really an important consideration. The other part is that if you don't have this mentality of being able to understand what's acceptable and unacceptable, you could, and this happens, I think this is the standard, is where people put their head in the sands and don't turn over all the rocks of what are all the possible risks, what are all the possible things that could go wrong. And they don't want to think about, hey, this could happen, that could happen. They don't turn over every stone and find it. But those risks exist whether you take the effort to think it through or not. It's just information. And the better approach is to build the discipline inside the organization or inside your team, is to not be afraid to turn over all the stones, make things fail in development, make things fail in testing, break everything. Don't test parts so they pass, test parts so that they fail. And I'm not saying that's what you submit to your your regulatory submission, but you want to learn exactly what the extents of your device are. If the regulatory requirement is that it has to pass at 10 newtons and you get to 10, but if you test a failure, they all fail at 11, you would feel a lot different about that than if they're all failing at 100, right? And you need to know these things rather than just saying, hey, everything looks good, fingers crossed. No, much better to have the attitude of, let's figure out all the risk that exists, and we can accommodate some versus others, and that'll give us clarity when we enter the more complicated phases of manufacturing, clinical education, mass adoption, things like that. So realistically, you need to understand what is real and what is not real risk, for your product and your application, so you can make good decisions. And this is what hangs up teams all over the place, is they don't know how to deal with the risk. And so no one wants to make the hard decision. So everyone just says we can't accept the risk. And then you end up with an unwieldy project that never gets done. You're stuck in development land forever. And that doesn't help anyone. And it certainly doesn't help that patient who's waiting for that important innovation that you've developed. Meanwhile, you're so caught up in risk mitigation that you can't think about, how do I get this to market? Again, trust is a word I use a lot inside the companies, that if you have trust with your peers and your doctors that are working with you, then you're allowed and able to speak the honest part about how your product's performing or not performing. And if you do that, you can work through these things. So having a close team that knows what you're about, understands your makeup and how you approach problems, and understands your integrity, is really, those are important ingredients if you're going to approach a problem in the way that I've described here.
Neil, a quick question about the slide.
Yes.
So if I understood it right, if in a device or something we are making, if it is working under intended use, it should be acceptable.
Yeah, there's the risk there, just to kind of read between the lines, Sinki, that you could go, like there are, for example, for the products we make, there are standards that govern how the device shall perform. We have our on the books, like V&V testing. This is the clinical test. This is the bench test. Everything passes. And if you were to limit it to that, depending on how comprehensive your testing regimen is, your formal testing regimen is, maybe you're okay. But in my experience, that if you were to look in the mirror and say, hey, is that testing fully 100% comprehensive? Probably not. So like the amount of testing we do on products that is, above and beyond what is the requirement is like probably 2/3 of it is above and beyond, and 1/3 is the requirements. And what do we use that 2/3 of testing for? What we use it for is to determine how close to the sun are we, how close are we to the, not only the technical and regulatory requirements, but the business requirements of product performance or manufacturing yield or other things. And we really want to understand exactly what we've made, so that we know what risks we're taking on. And then if we're comfortable with the risks, then we'll go forward. But if we haven't done that extensive testing and you've done just what's required, you might be okay. And there might be a requirement. If you're a startup, you might not have the time to go do all that other stuff, but I would at least keep an eye on it. And again, have an honest conversation with yourself. If you know that your product is a little bit new and the standards are designed for a product that was a little bit different, and your product's going to be used in a somewhat unique way, and there's no requirement for you to test in that unique way, and everyone thinks it's going to get approved and you can bring it to market, okay, but maybe you want to test it anyways. Right. And that might not be a bad thing, to really understand what you have on your hands and really see what are the boundaries of your device or your technique that you're teaching doctors in terms of what it can and cannot do. I think that's important, because otherwise what I found is if you don't do it, the market will find it for you. And that's a much worse situation. And it's happened to me where we've brought a product to market and we've said, hey, we got it done really quick. And then the doctors start using it and everything starts falling apart. I mean, we never design a product where the patient's going to get hurt, but the procedure's not as efficient as we thought, or the product doesn't have the efficiency or that we expected, or things like that. And you go back and look at it. You said, okay, you had, rose-colored glasses on. These things were identifiable earlier on in the process. And if we had worked a little bit harder, we probably could have fixed it. But now we've already released the product. To go back and change it and update the regulatory and all that is like very difficult. So you need to have an honest conversation with yourself and your team, and with looking at your product for what it is. Do you really understand it well enough to account for those risks beyond the requirements?
Thank you.
All right. I've already kind of talked over this slide, so I won't belabor it. The only thing here is that if you don't know what you're doing, go ask. I mean, this is obvious, but very difficult. If you look around, and yourself included, no one you've identified a risk that you you think you can think it through because you're smart, but you don't really have experience, just go ask someone. It's much, much better. And it's you almost always free. So just go do that. And they'll tell you how to approach the problem or the different ways you might want to, test it or have different considerations. That's really, really important. Okay. Finally, what is bringing solution to market mean? I talked about that at the beginning, is you really need to strip down your product to the value it's going to add to a doctor and to a patient. And there's a huge appetite to, once you start looking into your product and looking at the competitors, to say, not only is our core technology better, but they don't have an ergonomic handle and their colors don't make sense in the operating room. And we're going to make it, the cable 6 feet longer so that it gets out of the sterile field. And we're going to do this and we're going to do that. And it all makes sense. It's not like these things might not be good ideas. But once you start cementing that in your plan, what you've actually done is you've added a lot of extra testing and work on the tail end, which might give you incremental value, but it doesn't keep that bring the solution to market mentality well enough by not considering the time part, the risk part, the testing part. So really think about what I like to think about anyways is like an iterative approach to product development, which is when you bring your product to market, think to yourself, this is generation one. Doesn't mean generation one is garbage. It just means it's generation one. And can you, if I say generation one, then the first thing that should come to your mind is there's an opportunity for a generation two. And generation two can have more doodads. The benefit of having generation two later is be a little bit humble that you maybe don't know exactly what the world is going to do with your device with generation one. So let generation one breathe. The market will tell you what generation two needs to be. Maybe it'll include some of the things you had always thought all along, but maybe it'll include things that you didn't consider. And those are really the ones the market wants. So why not then start with the product that can be used today, that can help patients now, and then let's find out. Let's figure out what can we add on later on by talking to our customers, seeing cases with our own two eyes, finding those value propositions, and then building on top of what we already have. That's a much better approach, is to really start with the product that has a very clear focus. And you can see how this comes all the way back to having a very strong defined need. So if you bring those two thoughts together, it'll help you bring clarity on how to avoid scope creep, which everyone loves to do. If you can test a bit longer, then we can market it for this or market it for that. But you need to have the discipline to really focus on what is going to add value. Finally, if you have that clarity, you should be able to bring your prototypes to a doctor or whomever, and there should be no head scratching or a lot of hand waving or explaining why these features are so important to them and all that. They should say, oh, of course, I'm going to use this in this procedure to do that. Yes, of course. It should be that clear. If you got to do a big conversation about how this is the greatest thing since sliced bread, there's something missing, either in your delivery, but maybe in the way you've targeted your product or what you developed. Maybe it's too complex. All right, so just doing a quick time check. I'm not going to go through all these slides because there's a lot here, but we're going to just quickly go through what's the framework for R&D to product development. And Ahmed, I saw your camera's back on. I think we've got 15 minutes, right, or so?
Yes.
Yeah, perfect. Okay, so the standard way you approach R&D design is something called a stage gate design process. Hopefully, most of you are familiar with that. When I was going to engineering, they didn't teach this. I wish they did. Perhaps they're teaching it now, or at least you're coming to this lecture. Why do they have that? This is a great little image I got online of how medical device development, all the different stops on the subway train, as it were, that you need to consider. And this picture actually is surprisingly accurate in terms of all the different things that you would need to consider. And if you do it all at the same time, you're going to get confused. Just like I was talking before, you have to do the big ticket items at the beginning and make sure that you focus on the right things at the right time. So the way we organize this is by doing it in phases. And you can kind of see that they've put some terms here for phases. We use slightly different ones. And I'll walk you through that. Why do we do phase gates? Is because you want to do a lot of planning and a lot of de-risking up front, especially in medical devices. The projects are so burdensome at the tail end, the amount of documentation, testing, manufacturing requirements, regulatory work, that if you have to make a change at the end, it is very, very complicated. So you really have to have, like I said at the beginning, a lot of focus. A phase gate approach really helps you as a tool to develop that focus in the design process. This is what we use. We have these different processes that we take things through. The feasibility and concept is really speaking to, we talked about the defined need and really understanding exactly what we're going to make. And what we'll typically do is make a concept, and how a concept is different than a prototype is the concept really just focuses on the one particular innovation that we need to prove is going to make a difference. So it's not a whole device. It might not even have like a handle or an adapter. It might just be the applicator part, showing that the applicator part can do something unique and new, and that it's got, the technology surrounding it that is realizable, meaning standard manufacturing techniques. We know how to control it. It's not totally avant-garde. If we can demonstrate that there's a need and the core technology is functional, then we have feasibility. Then the rest of it, the concept, the prototype phase would obviously makes a lot more sense. Then we're going to build around that and develop something that works like the final product. Once we get it working, that's technically, we don't burden ourselves with the aesthetics too much during the prototype phase, because again, that's putting too many things in the bag, and it reduces our focus. We'll come back and we'll redesign that product. We'll know exactly how it works. And then because we've studied it so well, we can make it not only aesthetically pleasing, but we can design it to work with current realizable manufacturing techniques, working with vendors to pick components and design options that are readily made, so we don't have the lead times that Sangeeta mentioned. And it'll look like we redesigned the product, but because we know so much about it from the prototype phase, it's really not as much work as you might think. And by then, we're in very good position to complete the process, as you see there: design, verification, and validation, and of course, how we're going to manufacture it. That's our process. And then we verify and validate the process as well. So this is the design, and the output of this design, of course, leads to regulatory filings and ultimately to commercial use. All right, so I won't go through all of this, but what we do for each of our phases before we get started, we have a very specific meeting as saying, okay, we're starting this phase, let's say the prototype phase. And what does the end of this phase look like? What are we going to have in our hands? How many doctors would have tested it? Like, how are we going to know that we've finished the prototype phase? And I know that might sound trivial, but if you actually start thinking about it and you go through all the different, inputs from IP, regulatory, marketing, clinical, sales, whatever, and you think about what exactly are you going to need to know in order to say you're ready to invest in the final commercial embodiment, there's actually quite a bit of discussion that happens there inside the teams to say, hey, do we have everything we need to get there? And if you realize you don't have everything, well, good to know that at the beginning, and then you can start building out the plan to make that realizable. With a few minutes we have left, I'm going to just walk you through an example. I think this probably makes it easier to understand all this and to bring it home. So this is a product we actually commercialized, and this sketch on the left is an actual sketch that we drew at Chicago Airport on what we wanted to do. And we had a device, which is a suture passing instrument. And for particular market reason, we had to ship it without suture preloaded. So we needed a way that the end user could load this instrument. It's a fairly complex instrument. It doesn't look like it here. And it has complex knots and all sorts of stuff. And we said, okay, well, we can't have the user tie these complex knots. So what is the need? We need a foolproof way that the user can apply the suture, like an instrument, to the suture passer, which is the tail end of it, or the tip of it is shown on the right here of this hand-drawn image. And if they can do it in one motion, then, or in a simple motion, and we can get it loaded, then they can complete the procedure with our instrument. And this was the need. And when we did that, we said, well, in doing that, what's the big deal? The big deal is trying to push a a suture spool and a little tail that's in this thing into a teeny tiny needle that's housed inside this shaft. And so we would make concepts that only did that. That's the only thing it did in the concept phase, is how can I take a manual, I use my thumb, I push this rod, it pushes this thing down, the needle can be found. I take the a needle and can I find it? And once we determined that that is viable, then we said, okay, then you can see in here, this little gray part and this little spring thing doesn't look too different than this white part. And we built a working prototype that had all the features. Once we knew how it worked, okay, now we can make something that looks like something you'd want to sell. And you can see a lot of the key elements, but some of the little features changed. Why? Because when we had to injection mold it, or when we need to find components, we changed some of the parts so that they were easily manufactured or easily sourced, and of course, aesthetically pleasing. But the core function of what forces and dimensions and tolerances, we already figured out in the prototype phase. So you can see how that phase, that, the first half of the presentation I shared, how that manifests in an actual product. And you can see this is the final product, and that's being used commercially now for many years. So I'll blow through these because we only have a few minutes, but you can see here, this was the product vision. And we had a number of different concepts that we evaluated. This one's the top is a push rod. This one is a button that they press, and this one's the one that they flip over. And the one that most reliably worked was the top, and that's what we did. Again, I won't spend too much time here. I'll skip over to the AI part, just so we have time to speak about that. All right. If you have any questions, I'm happy to stop there.
Neil, this is Sangeeta again. So as you mentioned about the concept to prototype, so if it seems like for each function, if do a prototype or design for each function and validate it separately in spite of making or building a whole function, a full device.
Not always. I think we only did that for where there was a high degree of complexity and where there was a lot of risk. But by the time we got to this stage, for example, there's a lot of things we knew we would work. Like there's an interlock here, there's a slide there, and this and that. Those ones we didn't prototype separately. Obviously, they're all part of the same design at the end. There are specific things in this particular design that have a high degree of dependency on alignment and tolerance, and those we would make 20 variations, each offset by 1,000th of an inch, and test them to see how sensitive the system was to inform the design. So I think you take an intelligent approach for, where is the risk, and then you can break that out if you can to study it individually, so you really have good control of it. Then you can put it back in the design. For those which you know how to do it already, you don't need to break that out. I think you can take an educated risk assessment on which ones need that deeper dive or further evaluation.
Thank you.
No problem. So again, I'll leave these slides up very briefly, but as you go through each of these phases, each of your different departments or each parts of the development process will have different inputs into the project. So you'll have increasing level of scrutiny and input from each of your departments. As your product is taking shape, so too are your other stakeholders, and you need to bring them all along concordant to where you are in the product, right? And so there's just some notes here on that. And you can see even at early stages, we're talking to, as Sangeeta mentioned before, materials and production, quality, process engineering. What exactly are their needs? Are we factoring them into the design so that we don't box ourselves into a corner? I've already talked about this design rig. I just mentioned this in passing. This is the tool on the bottom right where we actually offset things by 1,000th of an inch just to see what would happen. Prototypes are definitely your best friend. Make them often, and you don't have to make the whole product, as Sangeeta mentioned, to do that. Okay, I'm going to skip ahead. So we talked about already about how that moves forward. So I apologize, we ran out of time. I got a little bit ahead of myself on the other part of the presentation. What this is really saying about design for excellence is what I mentioned before, is really go to the to the ends and break your product. And I mean that, like actually break every component, find out what forces or what way you need to operate it in order for it to fail, and then understand that so that you know what the limit is. Okay, so let's talk about a little bit about AI-enabled technologies then with the time that we have, a few minutes here. So I'm not an AI expert at all, so I'm not going to qualify anything I say as coming from that perspective. But when I was thinking about this, and Ahmad asked me to add a few slides, it occurred to me that AI-enabled or machine learning-enabled technologies really have the same characteristics as any sufficiently advanced technology. And if you're trying to bring a very advanced technology to medical devices, you're going to be asked about the same questions that are asked for any advanced technology, which is, what is the impact to safety and efficacy? That's really the punchline when you do that. And the reality is that when you get asked about safety and efficacy, especially from a regulatory lens, they being the regulators, love falling onto known frameworks and spreadsheets or guidance documents through which they can evaluate, is your device safe and effective? Now, the issue with AI-enabled technologies is that the technology itself is way ahead of where the regulatory world is. And you have to understand that medical devices is a very conservative business. Like, this is not places where you just try things willy-nilly. It's not consumer goods. It's very buttoned down, and changes are very incremental for a reason, is because no one, the patient, the physician, the insurance companies, no one is out there wanting to take major risks on patients. So therefore, you have a very conservative view on how much technology you can introduce into the medical continuum. So that's why AI and machine learning, even though there's so much value it can add, it's going to be hamstrung by the risk-based approach that regulators and others, and even medical practitioners, take to incorporating that into their practice. So when I thought about it, that actually sounds a lot like how, like I mentioned, complex technologies or even clinical studies are evaluated. When you have a very complex technology, as I've been alluding to, the requirement is for a lot of verification and validation, a lot of testing, because you need to be able to demonstrate that for all this new stuff that it can do, that it won't lead to patient harm. And safety, in most cases, trumps effectiveness. And everyone's going to want to know, what are the boundaries of what you implemented here? And likewise, if you have an AI model and it's based on a large data set, then also in medical devices, typically you're doing validation studies, which can include clinical studies. And the number one question you get from a regulator is, what is the broader applicability of this study to the patient population that'll be treated with your product? And an AI model that has a certain database that isn't trained necessarily on the same set of patients that it will be used on are going to raise those same type of questions about bias and about broader applicability. So when you look at it through a couple of lenses here, on the technical side, the more sophisticated the tool, the more the V&V is going to be required. And so, if you can quantify the risk ahead of time for your AI-enabled technology in terms of effectively into locking it down so that it doesn't have an open-ended risk profile, then you'll have a much better chance at studying it, verifying it, validating it, and convincing a regulator that it's safe for clinical use. The other part is that, because the complexity is high, I would take in terms of how new it is and what it could afford in terms of a changing clinical practice, because you're already adding so much value, presumably with your AI or machine learning based technology. Try a less is more approach would be probably how I would start, which is really focus on an incremental gain. And that incremental gain is going to be so much more than the standard incremental gains people are getting with traditional technology advancements. That'll help you, because there's going to be enough technical risk just getting it out that you don't need to boil the ocean. Just get started. You're going to learn enough, and you can make that generation 2, like I talked about previously. On the regulatory side, in my research in advance of this presentation, as I would have thought, open-ended AI ML models or tools, they're already not being allowed in the marketplace, because it's impossible for a regulator to know if something's changing after it's been released. What is the risk profile? There's no way for them to know that. So therefore, you need to have a closed system, effectively meaning that it can be fully studied or statistically analyzed prior to it being launched. That's really an important consideration here. And the other way to kind of get around it is effectively is if you have an AI model that makes a suggestion, more for lack of a better term, and there's a skilled operator on the tail end who says, yeah, that's the right thing, you just help me get there faster. Well, then you really haven't changed the decision-making matrix, in which case the threshold from a risk perspective has come way down. It's not on your technology, it's still on the skilled operator, the radiologist, or whomever. And that is a totally different conversation from a regulatory perspective than I've detected the cancer and I'm suggesting you go get this type of treatment. Those are two very, very different things. Even if the sentence is explained the exact same way, even if the outcome is exactly the same, who's taking the decision is a very important consideration from regulators, because most regulatory agencies in the world, the doctors are not governed by the regulatory agencies. They have freedom to take medical decisions, whereas companies do not. And so therefore, you want to, if that might be an opportunity for you to get into the market by framing your AI or ML technology in a certain way. All the major ones around the world have started to draft guidance documents on this. So not all of them are finalized, but if you're going to get into this space, I would recommend reading them. They're usually the templates that they'll follow for approval going forward. So finally, on an AI side is that, I think there's going to be a whole pile of these things are coming out. I don't think that the larger companies have fully understood or contemplated how it's going to change many factors. So it's definitely coming, and the regulators are racing to catch up to it. But at the same time, if you're in the business of medical devices, understand that regulators do not want to be the inventors or scientists that are trying new things in the space. They do not want to be responsible for that. So you need to understand that you might have an incredible invention that's going to make a huge change in healthcare, but you have to understand that almost all systems in medical device are incremental changes. And if you're going for a big change, you better have deep pockets or a really good regulatory team, because it'll be hard, I think, to convince major regulatory agencies to take that bet if your technology is really out there and hard to understand or quantify the risk of. So I'll break there. I know that was a bit of a whirlwind of an hour. Hopefully that was useful, though, and happy to answer any questions that you guys might have.
Neil, thank you very much. Again, such an outstanding and insightful presentation, as always, with a lot of key insights on what to consider when you're formulating your R&D strategy and plan. I'm again mindful that we are over time. There is a question in the chat, by the way. How much influence do commercial goals of a business have on R&D strategy? It's more of like a general question.
Yeah, a lot. I mean, everything. I mean, it's the reality is that the first slide I said, you're trying to get your product to market, right? And you want it to be used on patients to improve patient welfare. So there are practical limitations for how much you can sell a device for into the market. And if you price yourself right out, that's not great for the patients, right? And you need to consider that right up front. Otherwise, what's the point, right? So I think anyone who's in this space is trying to improve patient welfare, trying to make, improve a patient condition, whatever the case may be. But there are constraints for not just cost of development, but cost of final product. And so you need to know that, and you need to work inside that. Now, that being said, be creative in one way. So if you're adding a value proposition, let's say you save 10 minutes of operation time, and you take the space of 2 existing products, or there's some other efficiencies, that has value, and you can, typically charge a premium for those products because they do add incremental value. If they reduce complication rates or things like that, there are ways to consider that, but you can't be oblivious to it. If you make a product that doesn't have the market in mind, you won't have the focus you need. You need to get your arms around the whole business of medical devices if you're going to make a good R&D project. You can't work in a silo. I think that's the essence of what I'm trying to share today. You have no choice. And if each department works on their own, you're going to end up with a hodgepodge product that's no good. You need to have someone or some group of people that can understand the whole thing. Like when I say get their arms around it, they understand every department and they can factor their inputs into the strategy so that it's considering everything. You need smart people who can do that. Otherwise you get lost. That's really what the challenge is in R&D.
Right. Thank you very much, Neil. Any other questions from the audience? Neil has been very generous with his time, staying over. Yes, I think there is a question from Nargis about the previous lecture about the risk estimation. A fresh grad or postdoc, we may not have a good grasp of possible risks to include in our cost estimation. May I know your suggestion?
Yes. So in terms of how to estimate the risk, so there's it's a good question. So if you just started and you don't know, if you have like an invention, but you haven't had the experience of making medical devices and seeing how things have played out, what's real, what's not real, get some advisors who have been around the block and who have released, even if it's not the same medical device as yours, but who have been in the business of releasing medical devices, and tell them, even in 30 minutes, if you tell them this is what I'm worried about, they'll tell you in 10 seconds, those are the things you need to worry about, and these are things you don't need to worry about. And so I think if you're not familiar with how to evaluate what you're working on or what your test results actually mean or what the doctors are actually saying, you need to have that humility to bring people in who have that experience so that they can provide you that guidance that you need. When I started at Baylis, I had no idea what was going on. And so everything I found, I was like, oh, well, the project's dead, of course, so we're not moving forward.
Mm-hmm.
And then, Chris and Frank, who the owners of Baylis, would say, well, no, you're going to fix this and that, you don't have to worry about it, and you go forward. So once you've gone through it a handful of times, you start to see the patterns of what's risky and what's, what needs to be fixed and what doesn't, and what's going to trip you up and what's not. So find people that have done it and they'll guide you. I wish there was a better answer, but the reality is experience is hard to trump in that case.
Thank you very much, Neil. And again, thank you very much for all the amazing work you do in educating our students, as well as leading one of the, if not the most successful medical device company, Canadian medical device company in the field. And we hope to see more successful companies in the sector as well. Thank you again. And any final comments, questions from the audience?
Yeah, my email's my first initial and last name at baylismedtech.com. So if anyone, or you can find me on LinkedIn. So if anyone, I know there's some comments about following up directly offline. Happy to connect with anyone here. And if you're in this space, I'm really excited for you. It's a wonderful, wonderful space. It's incredibly rewarding to make a difference in patients' lives. So I know it's a hard road, and I probably scared a couple of you off of it, but hopefully you come back. It's definitely worthwhile. So look forward to connecting with many of you offline as well.
Thanks again so much, Neil, for that. Thanks everyone for joining us this evening. Our next session is taking place on Thursday, March 30th, and we're having a lecture on the quality management and management systems and process management. So see you next week.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.